welcome every welcome everyone to the Monhegan Associates Ecology Lecture Series for this summer. Tonight, our lecture is the Monhegan Wildlands, Artists, Ecologists, and the Resilience of a Maine Island. This talk is a rich mix of Monhegan painting and photography, historical documents, and scientific inquiry, all making up a portrait of the Monhegan Wildlands over the past century and a half. As all things in the natural world and in human society, this talk is a work in progress. It's actually an outline of a research project leading to an exhibition at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art in 2024-25. The exhibition will then move in the summer of 2025 to the museum, the Monhegan Museum of Art and History. Our presenters tonight are Barry Logan and Frank Goodyear, both of Bowdoin College. Barry Logan is the Samuel S. Butcher Professor in the Natural Sciences. He studies plant responses to environmental stress. In particular, Barry is interested in photosynthesis and mechanisms protecting leaves from intense light. He also examines the impact of parasitic mistletoe on spruce trees along the Monhegan coast. Frank Goodyear is the co-director of the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. Previously, Frank worked as curator of photographs at the National Portrait Gallery of the Smithsonian Institution. The author of many articles and 5 books, including a book on Theodore Roosevelt's scientific expedition to British East Africa, published by the Smithsonian Books in 2017. He is also at work on a study of Winslow Homer's interest in photography. Before I hand this over to Barry and Frank, I would like to thank 2 people who have made this lecture series possible. Claire Durst has been in charge of all the technological aspects of this Zoom presentation. Rebecca Fitzpatrick has been in charge of promoting the lecture series on the MAI website as well as on social media. Believe me, none of us would be here without their hours of diligent work. The lecture will last for 45 minutes, followed by a 15-minute question and answer period led by Tish Miller. The speakers have requested that questions will be addressed at the end of their talk. If you would like to put your questions in the chat, that's just fine. And with that, I will hand this over to Barry and Frank.
Candace, thank you so much. And thank you all for checking in. I'm Barry, so that you can keep the head straight. I'm Frank. That's Frank. And we're speaking with you from the dining room of the Trailing U. We've been here since Tuesday, doing some work in the forests and also some archival work in the museum and down in the library. And we'll be heading home tomorrow. But it's a real pleasure to be with you and to get a chance to share this project that we have. I'm gonna share my screen. Just a few thumbs up. Are you looking at my screen? Is everything good just as it should be? Okay, great. Yeah. And so Candace did a great job of introducing us. The title is at the top there. As Candace had said, I am a biologist. I study plants, mostly trees these days. I've been at Bowdoin for 22 or 3 years and have been coming to Monhegan to study the interaction between spruce trees and your parasitic dwarf mistletoe, off and on, mostly off, unfortunately, over the last few years. for about 20 years. And so my connections to the island as a scientist are through the mistletoe spruce interaction. And I want to start here with a favorite Rockwell Kent painting of mine. It's called Young Spruces. And I think it does a really nice job of illustrating what we're trying to accomplish, both in the talk that we have for you today, and then ultimately in the exhibition that will come in 2024, at the end of 2024. This image tells an ecological story. So if you pause and take it in for a moment, as you know, what you're looking at here is land that had been converted to pasture, returning to forest. And so this is a really dynamic process that Kent is capturing here. You have change and then the resilience and the return of forest. I'll turn it over to Frank to say a few words here now.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting us. It's so wonderful to be a part of this. One of my favorite paintings in the Bowdoin College Museum of Art's collection is this wonderful painting that Kent painted in 1907. And it's a painting that's always been slightly, I've had some questions about the painting. In particular, I was always the trees, the tops of which you see in the foreground at the bottom. It didn't seem as though these trees related well with the landscape behind us. And we've been doing some wonderful research in the course of working on this exhibition and corresponding with various Rockwell Kent scholars. And we've come to discover that these trees were likely added in the 1950s when Kent came back to Monhegan after more than 30 years away. And when Barry came to the museum to talk with me about the project on which we're working, all of a sudden, when he talked about the forest ecology and the changes that have happened on the land, all of a sudden I began to start thinking that perhaps in the 40 plus years interval between the time when Kent started this painting and the time when he was experiencing Monhegan again in the early 1950s, that the landscape had literally changed, and that in this view, it would be appropriate to add a stand of trees. And all of a sudden, for an art historian who sort of naively believed that Monhegan had basically sort of stayed the same for all of these many centuries that artists have come to Maine, came to realize, because of Barry's research and the kinds of questions that he was asking, is that this is an incredibly dynamic landscape that is sort of ever changing. And so this is, one of the paintings that will certainly take center stage in our exhibition. I also want to just give a quick plug here at the outset. The Bowdoin College Museum of Art currently has on view an exhibition entitled At First Light, 2 Centuries of Artists in Maine. This was an exhibition that was organized to coincide with the bicentennial of Maine statehood in 2020. But of course, because of the pandemic, it was 2 years delayed. The exhibition is now on view at the museum. If you find yourself back in Maine, I encourage you to come visit us in Brunswick. And it will be on view through November 6th. But importantly, we have several sections of the museum that are dedicated to Monhegan. And so in this particular corner, we see, again, working right to left, Samuel Rolt Triscutt, 2 wonderful 1913 studies by Leon Kroll, a George Bellows painting also from 1930, from 1913. And then on the far left, an Alice Kent Stoddard, and below it, a Reuben Tam. And indeed, Monhegan has been such a important artistic center for art making. It's great to be able to highlight it with this exhibition. And the exhibition that we hope to do that will open in the December of 2024 will likewise bring together artworks, photographs, both historic and contemporary, as well as imagery that explain some of the important science that Barry and his colleagues have been a part of.
Thanks, Frank. I'll add to this too that, and I know that you come to this talk through the Monhegan Associates, that what we're trying to accomplish here with the talk and with the eventual exhibition is to integrate the voices of artists through their works, the knowledge of forest ecologists, and the techniques that forest ecologists use in order to learn things about the past, but also the milestone stewardship decisions and implementation that have really made all of this possible. So it's a celebration of the Monhegan Associates and what you have accomplished and what you are accomplishing in the present day as well. And I was mindful as we were organizing this talk of your particular level of knowledge of the island. And so I know that you know it very well, and in many regards, far better than either Frank or I. And at the same time, I want to be sure that we've got a common understanding of the trajectory of the forests. And so I just want to race through, if I can, some of the hallmark changes that have occurred in the forests over the last 200 odd years. And this will then serve as a reference point for the rest of the talk. So bear with me as I do this. As you no doubt know, in the 19th century was a period of settlement on Monhegan Island, and also the formation of pasture. So there was a good deal of the perimeter forests of the island were removed, and pasture was formed, and livestock was then pastured out on that land. And it was at the very end, or the very early part of the 20th century, where the last of the livestock animals were removed from the island. And that pasture land was effectively abandoned. And in a place like Monhegan and elsewhere in New England and the northeast of the United States, that abandoned pasture land is going to return to forest. And that is precisely what has happened. It's a real exhibition of the resilience of the land here on Monhegan and more broadly. So that pasture land abandonment led to forestry recolonization, reforestation. And because of the climate and the nature of abandoned pasture land, the trees that came back on Monhegan were white spruce. And that's going to be important to the story down the road. So what you find or found at the time was white spruce colonizing those perimeter forests. In the middle part of the 20th century, you had the introduction of deer, and those deer had a profound impact on the structure of the forests, an impact that we'll delve into here as we go. The forests, these perimeter forests at least, and I'm leaving to the side the cathedral woods here for the moment. We're really talking about these forests that came back on abandoned pasture land. But those forests through the latter part of the 20th century were experiencing a good deal of distress, as many of you know. White spruce is vulnerable to the parasitic dwarf mistletoe. So you had a lot of white spruce decline at the hands of the mistletoe. The deer were browsing tree saplings into oblivion. You had the invasion with thorny, unpalatable, exotic, invasive plants. You had rubus and barberry and whatnot. That really typified that part of the island at the time. The deer were removed very near to the turn of the millennium, so just before the year 2000. And that has set in motion an extraordinarily dynamic and, for me, wondrous and really promising change in these perimeter forests, which is marked by the return of broadleaf shrubs and trees. And so you now witness on those lands that had been pasture and then dominated by white spruce, broadleaf trees, aspens, big-toothed and quaking aspens, red maple out there, white birch are some of the trees that dominate the regions that I've gotten to know best. So that just serves as to lay a base for us all in an understanding of what's happened to some of these forests. I'm going to turn it back over to Frank to talk a little bit about the artistic representation that was afoot on islands at the turn of the last century.
Yeah, Barry, thanks. So what's, as many of you know, there have been artists who have been coming to Monhegan since the 1850s. John Henry Hill arriving in 1857, Aaron Shattuck the year after. These were artists who were visiting. They may have been there for a day or two. By the end of the 19th century, you begin to get not only increased numbers of artists coming to the island, but a number of artists who make the decision to live here year round. And perhaps most famously is Samuel Peter Rill Trisket, who would settle here, build a house, and did a remarkable job documenting the island in all seasons. It's really at the turn of the century that a new group of young New York modernists, sort of rejecting the academic traditions that characterized the work of previous generations, began to discover and settle here on Monhegan. It was led by Robert Henry, who came first in 1903. Henry was an influential teacher, art teacher in New York City, and encouraged a number of his students to look anew at the world and to try to understand the forces of modern life, whether it's the street culture of Manhattan or the industrialization of certain industrial cities. But he also encouraged his students to discover wilder places sort of beyond the urban centers. And of course, it's Rockwell Kent who is going to be one of the first of his acolytes who would come to Monhegan in 1905. And it would be followed by a great number of others, including Edward Hopper, who first comes to the island in 1916 and returns for several subsequent summers. But what the island that these young modernist artists discovered was one that had been radically changed during the course of the 19th century because of sheep farming on the island. And many of the headlands, but in other sections of the island as well, were largely denuded of trees and other sort of low vegetation. And so in this work from around 1918, we see a Monhegan that is very different than what Monhegan certainly looks like today. And again, for an art historian, it's really exciting to work with Barry and others who really have traced the evolution of this forest ecology, because what we're seeing with these artists who are dedicated to portraying the real thing is that they are witness to some of these changes on the land, and therefore can provide all sorts of insights for us in terms of the way in which these lands looked and how they evolved over time.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. And I mean, I find it very, very interesting that my understanding of what partly motivated those artists was to try to capture something that was authentic and authentically natural. And as they were doing so, they were ushered out by their instructor in New York City to Monhegan Islands, and the Monhegan Island that they arrived upon was probably at its most ecologically disturbed of all time, in a way. And I share this image here just to underscore the point that what played out on Monhegan Island was really characteristic of what was playing out in the broader region. And so although we know it especially well, both from an ecological standpoint and because of all the artistic works that were created here on island, we know it especially well on Monhegan. The story that we can tell of Monhegan is a broader story as well of the region. And so what I'm showing you here, and these are data that were collected by land use historians and ecologists at the Harvard Forest in Petersham, Massachusetts. These are among the people that I turn to for insights on land use history and the present day ecology of New England. I think they're exceptional. I think they're the best of our kind in terms of the work that they are producing. But what you're looking at here, as you can see, is a timeline from 1600 to near to the present day. And the y-axis here is forest cover. So it's the percent of by state of forest cover. And why I share this is simply to underscore the point that this, the latter part of the 19th century and into the early part of the 20th century is the period where New England experiences the greatest degree of ecological disturbance in the form of forest removal. And this is forest removal mostly for livestock pasture, but also for croplands as well. And so, here you see Maine. Maine lags behind just a little bit, and it also has a lesser degree of forest removal. This is mostly because the North Woods were not deforested at that period. But if we contemplate here, Massachusetts, for example, here, the peak in Massachusetts comes a little bit earlier. It coincides quite nicely with the most active period of writing for Henry David Thoreau, for example. So we have been reflecting on artists and their search for natural authenticity. And the same could be said for Thoreau, right? Thoreau is thought of as a foundational figure in the American conservation and environmentalism movements. And yet he was sitting at Walden in his cabin at a time when the surrounding landscape was as deforested as it has ever been. And so I think it's just an important point to appreciate about what might have motivated some of these artists of different kinds.
As Barry mentioned, we're on Monhegan now in order to be doing some archival research up at the Monhegan Museum, and we're so appreciative of the generosity of Jen Pye and Ed Deasy and others who've helped make our time here last couple days special. But our research extends beyond Monhegan. It extends beyond the libraries at Bowdoin College and the Art Museum. And we have spent some time, at various other places that we wanted to share with you. For indeed, there are many partners in telling this story. I think there's a number of really interesting things that we're looking for. We're trying to understand better something about the indigenous history of Monhegan Island, recognizing, of course, that the 200 years that we're considering in this exhibition represent only really a blip in the larger history of this place and its region. But our research has really focused a lot on some of the photographic records. And so what you see here are some reproductions of photographs at the Maine Historic Preservation Commission. And that sweatered arm and hand that you see on the left is none other than Earl Shuttleworth, the Maine state historian, who's been an invaluable partner in helping us move through the incredible photographic collections at the Maine Historic Preservation Commission. We love this picture. Again, these are just iPhone snapshots that we've taken during the course of our research. We'll, if we end up using these in the exhibition, we'll go back and work with the real thing. But we loved this particular image of a farmer who's tilling the soil with an oxen on one side and a horse on the other. Or this view of sheep in the foreground, in sort of open pasture land. You can see Lighthouse Hill and the lighthouse at the back right of this particular picture. Of course, it's so interesting that 1905 is the year in which the last of the sheep are on Monhegan, and they are really removed thereafter. Is also the same year in which Rockwell Kent comes to the island for the first time. So there's a really interesting sort of overlap at that particular time period.
Frank, these are Hudson photographs?
Yeah, you know, I haven't labeled all of them here. There's some of these are by Eric Hudson, but we've also looked at, of course, at Samuel Triskett's photographs. Triskett, as many of you know, was not only a painter, but he was also a photographer as well. And then, of course, the incredible postcard collections that Lorimer Brackett and other manufacturers of postcards in the first half of the 20th century put together. And so, again, these are some of those images. Oopsie, sorry. More sheep. We've been on the lookout for sheep. Incredible to think what these lands look like today, for they are indeed greatly changed.
I'll add, Frank had referenced Earl Shuttleworth. Earl is a big fan of Monhegan Island. So he is the historian of the state of Maine, but he has a particular fondness and attachment for Monhegan Island. And he, although I think he's emeritus now, he's actively on the hunt for things to add to their historic preservation collection, and will distribute materials of one kind or another as well. And he can tell quite a colorful story about the rescue of some of those Hudson photographs, which were in a home, like so much of this old art. And somebody had the presence of mind to contact him, and Earl had the presence of mind to quickly conserve and bring those into the collection. So in addition to those photographs, maps are going to be central to the exhibition, and they're central to our understanding of Monhegan Island. Frank and I have been to the Osher Map Library, which is a world-class map library at the University of Southern Maine in Portland. Its director is a woman named Libby Bischoff, and she ushered us through a really terrific and informative day, the first of many that we'll spend down there. Talking about maps and their importance and how they convey information. And I'll give you just one example of a map that's particularly informative for us. This is a coastal survey map. This is a blow up of Monhegan Island and a coastal survey map of Muscongas Bay. This was done in 1873. And what makes it so informative and valuable is that the map maker here has taken the time to put this hatching in for existing forest. And so this area here, which is all hatched, was in forest in 1873. And the margins here and down here below were so near the Seal Ledges and down below Lobster Cove. Those were not in forest in 1873. That was pasture land. So this goes a long way towards helping us understand the extent of pasture land formation, and what are the boundaries of what had been or what remains the Cathedral Woods and the area that has never been cleared. Here is another source of information that we're turning to. This is property assessments, death and taxes, right? So this is data that comes back from the latter part of the 19th century and early into the 20th century. These are data that were drawn and published in a book by
Charles McLean.
Charles McLean, that some of you will know. I've broken this up so that it's hopefully viewable to you. Assessments of principal taxpayers on Monhegan Island, 1865 to 1905. What I'm showing you here is the 1865 data, and it's broken out by individual, and then their possessions, their property, so to speak, is listed as such. And so we can look here across and see that in 1865, for example, there were 170 sheep on the island. And that wasn't the peak. The peak comes in a later decade, but then you watch the precipitous decline. There are relatively few sheep documented in the assessments in 1895, and there are 0 sheep in 1905, that is. And so these can help us to mark the boundaries of livestock pasturing on the island. And then, of course, the cathedral woods themselves serve as their own form of a historical document, if you will. There's good support for the likelihood that that land was never cleared. And so it bears the signature characteristics of what we could think of as the prehistoric forest on Monhegan Island, or at least the recent prehistoric forest. And I'll get into that in a moment, the deeper history of the forests. And so it's a classical, what we would describe as a spruce fir forest. It has a lot of the characteristics of the boreal forests that we tend to think of as Canada and Alaska. But there's a little tongue of boreal forest that reaches down to the coast of Maine and into New Brunswick, Canada. And you are near the southern terminus of that. So for those of you who may be familiar with forests farther south in central New England or southern New England, as you know, if you've been on the island, as I know you have, the cathedral woods is different, right? It's red spruce and fir. Those don't tend to dominate in central or southern New England. And so we can learn a lot about what the forest may have looked like by studying the cathedral woods, and certainly the artists were and remain captivated by the cathedral woods.
I'm a great fan of Samuel Peter Rolt Triscuit. I think his watercolors are wonderful. Of course, as an art historian, as I look at a work like this, I think about the sort of English landscape tradition in which he trained, and I can't help but sort of contextualize it within the larger sort of history of landscape painting in late 19th century Europe and America. But again, working with Barry, I've come to see this watercolor and others by Triscuit through an entirely new lens, for I feel as though, as much as Triscuit, a very thoroughly trained painter who was so knowledgeable about artistic tradition, is also very cognizant of the changes in the land, and is really trying to capture here, I think, sort of an ancient woodland. And this is going to be really helpful as we tell the history of the forest ecology of the island.
Here I want to share one of the postcards that we found in the collection that Earl Shuttleworth shared with us. There's a vast collection of these postcards up at the Monhegan Museum as well. This is a Lorimer Brackett postcard of the cathedral woods. I would just pause to allow everybody to take it in. I think it's maybe the most arresting image of the cathedral woods that I have seen, at least a photographic image of it.
When Barry first showed this to me, I thought that this was the Mariposa Grove in California. Monhegan, it's an iconic place. When we think of Monhegan, we think of the sea, the ocean crashing on the headlands. We think of the fisheries and the harbor. We don't necessarily, our mind doesn't initially go to the cathedral woods, but in works like this, we understand how sublimely beautiful these places are.
It begs the question, at least it did for me, about what the prehistoric forest looked like, and how do we learn about the composition of prehistoric forests. And and Monhegan is fortunate to have had somebody subject the island to pretty intensive study of the composition of ancient forests. And that person was a palynologist, and that's a person who studies pollen grains. What I'm showing you here, so I want to describe for you just briefly how this kind of work is done to get a sense for what ancient forests look like. Nobody's around to look at them today; they're gone, right? Or that their moment has passed, at least. And the people who reconstruct ancient forests using pollen take advantage of the fact that pollen grains, as you know, are many of them are dispersed in the wind, and they help to complete the reproduction of trees in this case. And so they carry the male reproductive cells to the cones or the flowers of other trees to allow for pollination and successful seed set and reproduction. They're remarkably resistant to decay. So they're super tough little microscopic objects. And not only that, but they're uniquely shaped. And so here I've given you these are scanning electron micrograph, highly magnified, false colorized images of the pollen of pine and birch and grass and oak here. So they look different, they're recognizable. And if you're an expert in this, you can get this right down to the species of pine just by looking at the shape of the pollen. And the beauty of this is that this pollen is so decay resistant that if it settles into a body of water, say, for example, the meadow at Monhegan Islands, it will settle into the sediment, and the sediment will accumulate layer upon layer, right? Such that the deepest sediment is the oldest sediment. And you can row out onto the meadow and drive a corer into that sediment, and you can extract a core of sediment from the meadow, and you can then separate it out, and using microscopic techniques, you can begin to take a census of the pollen grains, and the pollen grain density will give you a sense for what kind of trees or other plants producing pollen were surrounding that body of water. And you can utilize other chemical techniques to date that sediment. So we can associate what we see in terms of the pollen census with particular dates down through history. I'll give you the results of this project, which was done on Monhegan Island in 1978 by Lisa Gay Bostwick. This is what she finds when she examines the sediments from the meadow, which, by the way, has been watery for 10,000 years. This is about as deep a record of forest as you're going to find in New England anywhere. And that is because prior to this, we had a mile or two of ice sitting on top of Monhegan Island and much of New England. And so the forests that we see here are the forests that came back after basically all of the life on Monhegan and the surroundings, all the way down to Massachusetts, basically, had been scraped off by that glacial period. So what I'm showing you here is the depth of the sediment on this side, and this is the associated age of that sediment. And so down at the bottom of this is 10,000 years ago, and up near the top is 1,000 years ago, and everywhere in between. And what you can see is that spruce dominated in the earliest forest, and then pine and birch dominated for a period. Hemlock played a big role here for a several thousand-year period. These are not fleeting moments, right? We're talking about time that's almost beyond human comprehension. Hemlock drops out here. That hemlock dropping out, that happened through the entire region. We don't know why. It could be that some sort of introduced pest had a liking for hemlock. In any case, birch appears, oaks have their moment, and then that decays. And then, sure enough, the grasses appear in the record, and this is when you had forest conversion to pasture land. I find this fascinating, and I think the lesson from it is that dynamism is the history and not just the present day of the Monhegan Island forests, right? So over their history, the forests of Monhegan have been changing, maybe at a different time, at different speeds than today, but nonetheless, they have been changing. And these changes are driven by changes in climate. They're driven by changes in patterns of precipitation. The ocean circulations around Monhegan had a profound, they still have a profound influence on the local climate. And as those patterns of circulation, those currents were forming and decaying over time, you have changes in climate that drive these changes in forest composition.
And of course, humans also have had a profound, impact on the lands. And of course, I think one of the things that I'm very excited about with this exhibition is to think about some of the stewardship decisions that have been made over the last 200 years. And with the introduction of sheep pastures in the 19th century, the closing out of sheep, the introduction of deer, which happened at the same time, 1954, as the gentleman who we see on the screen here, Ted Edison, helped to establish the Monhegan Associates. Of course, Ted and his family had begun coming to Monhegan in the early 20th century. In the 1930s, Ted begins buying up plots of land in an effort to conserve these wildlands. Ultimately, he makes 73 real estate purchases from 23 different owners to put together this incredible piece of land. And by making the decision to keep this land forever wild, to conserve it in its kind of natural state, that is a decision as well, and that has certainly marked the period of the last 75 or so years. Of course, the decision to introduce deer, to remove deer, the kinds of decisions that the associates are involved in today, these all have impacts on the island. And we've been sort of struck as we've been working on this project, the incredible resilience of the island. There is a sense that the island certainly has changed, but it has come back. And I think in the 21st century, this is a really interesting and I think ultimately very positive message that we can send to visitors to the exhibition or readers of the book that we're putting together. The sense that making wise scientific decisions about land use can lead to really positive outcomes. And so Ted Edison is certainly at the heart of this project.
Yeah, I would add only to that I think Ted Edison, I hope, would be very proud of the wildlands today and the ways in which they are stewarded. And you, I think, as those stewards, should celebrate what you've accomplished out there. I know it's through no small amount of effort and dedication. This resilience that the landscape can exhibit and demonstrate for us is really only possible because it's placed under conservation. And I will tell you that when I first arrived in Maine and was scouting around for places to work, I reached out to somebody that many of you may know. He's a forester at UMaine, Bill Livingston. And I said, got any tips or suggestions for me? And he was the one who suggested that I come out to Monhegan Island. So he's my Robert Henry. But I'll tell you, he said, ecologically minded land stewards out there in the Monhegan Associates, and the place is reliably conserved. And so if you have a light touch in the work that you do, you'll find that it's a great place to do it. And I have found that from the very beginning. And so I'm really grateful to all of you for that. To get back to the change in the landscape, your landscape, here we see another postcard which you see here a mid-century postcard that has the return of that spruce forest. So this was all pasture some decades before this photo was taken. And then here again, a Warner Taylor photograph, which is a large format of this is in the Monhegan Museum. And what you're looking at here again, this was all pasture that is now back in forest in the 1950s or so, I think. And that's mostly white spruce forest. Of course, you don't need me to tell you that white spruce forest has experienced a lot of challenge and stress. This organism here is a principal source of stress. These little brown projections that you see growing out of that white spruce branch are the dwarf mistletoe. And this is a parasitic plant, which over time, 20 years, can kill a mature white spruce tree. So this is what you see here along the #1 trail up from Dead Man's Cove is, and this is an old picture of mine, but standing deadwood, these are white spruce that have been killed by dwarf mistletoe. And part of this exhibition we will try, because this is near and dear to me, this is the subject of a significant arm of my research program, to understand the relationship between this parasite and the host, such that a diminutive little parasite like this can kill a mature tree. And we have some insights into how that plays out. Here you see a photo. This is a classical witch's broom. It should be familiar to you from walks on the island. This is actually the locus of infection on this tree, which is near death. And, part of the extraordinary aspects of the mistletoe infection here is represented by the fact that on a tree near death, the healthiest looking branches are the infected branches. And that says a lot about how mistletoe makes a living on a spruce tree. It's able to manipulate a white spruce at least, in order to withdraw a disproportionate share of the spruce's resources, to direct those resources towards the infection to benefit the mistletoe at the expense of the host. And this kind of thing really marked the perimeter forest. This is a picture from the highest elevation on the Pebble Beach Trail. This is a place where we've cited a lot of our work. This is probably a 20-year-old photo now. And this is the consequence of, two factors that really marked the second half of the 20th century. Mistletoe is one. You see a lot of fallen deadwood, some standing deadwood here. These are infected trees. They're all white spruce that you see. They're not able to grow to a degree where they will lead to a closed canopy, which might have facilitated succession towards another form of forest. It's in a bit of a state of arrest because of the mistletoe. And down below, you've got a thorny, exotic, invasive, shrubby understory here. I don't see barberry in this image, but that certainly was a very prominent, thorny, invasive understory plant. And that's in large measure because they're unpalatable to the deer. And the deer, prior to my taking this image, had been browsing everything else. And so this image, as I say, is a little bit dated. But I will point out that although we think of this as a dastardly dude here, the mistletoe, it's a native plant. It belongs on your forest if you want to think in your forest, if you want to think in those terms. And what has led to this kind of problematic proliferation of it is the disturbance that changed the forest dynamics and changed the role that white spruce plays in the forest. So when you clear the forest to make way for pasture and abandon that pasture and allow for trees to reinvade, white spruce is going to reinvade. And so what you're left with then is large areas of solely white spruce, which falls prey to the mistletoe. But although we think of correctly Japanese barberry as an exotic invasive, it wouldn't be right to think of the mistletoe as such. And we can recruit the help of artists down through the ages in helping to reinforce that point. And here's an image, a painting of Edward Hopper, and although he never described it as such. This, to me, looks for all the world like a dead spruce tree with a witch's broom that was driven by dwarf mistletoe. And you can find George Bellows paintings that have the same kind of signature impacts. So we know at least that the dwarf mistletoe was here 100 years ago. And in fact, the ecologists can tell you it was here long before that.
So Barry and Frank, we're just about out of time. If you could wrap up.
I will. Yeah, we'll wrap up here. I want to wrap up by fast forwarding, and if Candace, if you grant me 2 or 3 minutes, that's
Right.
all I'll need.
You got it.
So if we fast forward then to an image of the Pebble Beach Trail today, or this was a year ago, what do you have? This you have to celebrate as members of the Monhegan Associates. Here again, you have a dead white spruce, but now what you've got is red maples coming back. You have a birch in the background there coming back. I've seen, not so much on the Pebble Beach Trail, but farther out to the headlands, you see a lot of big-toothed aspen. These are native broadleaf deciduous trees that have been released to grow since the removal of deer. Yeah. And so what you're going to have in time is a closed canopy broadleaf deciduous native forest of a different composition, which will itself be beautiful. And the last thing I'll share with you is that I have, in the last year, recruited students from the Monhegan School into a study of these trees. I was out in May to core these trees with, this is Nora and Brownell and Dana. Those are the members of the school community this year. We cored some of these trees with the permission of the associates and then counted the rings to age these trees. Because if our understanding of the reemergence of these trees is accurate, then they shouldn't be any older than the removal of the deer. And in fact, these trees are 23 years old, which is almost exactly when you might expect for them to have emerged. And that's not my number, that's their number. They did this work with their teacher. And so I'm really pleased to have gotten to know the school, the teacher, and the students, and I'll be coming back next year. We're thinking now about what's to come for us. So I'll leave you with this. This is an image of that same place that I took yesterday. And you can see it's a native understory of chest-high shrubs and broadleaf deciduous trees that are quickly closing in a canopy and overtopping the white spruce. So props to you for what you've been able to accomplish there. It's change, but it's change for good, I think, and something worthy of celebration to be. We wanted to point out, and I'll allow Frank to do it, that we have others joining us on the project.
Yeah, very quickly in conclusion, recognizing the power that artists can play in helping to reveal insights into some of this history, we've invited 2 artists to join us to create new artistic projects. The first is Akra Shep, a photographer from New York, who importantly did a photographic survey of the islands of New York. Akra is a really remarkable photographer and educator. His most recent project has involved photographing the Occupy Wall Street movement and New York City under COVID. And now we've invited him to re-photograph the wildlife of Monhegan. And so he's on island right now, and he will be over the course of the next year creating a series of new 21st century images of the island that will be part of the exhibition and the book.
And then lastly, Barbara Putnam is with us as well, and she works in a couple of different media. She too is on islands. She's just off screen for what it's worth, and she works to create these block prints of natural subjects. This is bladderwort, bladderwrack, from the coast of Maine, and then also works in fabric some. And her work tends to meld scientific inquiry and the results of science and ecology and conservation matters in her artistic representation. And so be on the lookout for both. They will be on the islands creating work that will be incorporated into the exhibition in time. We'll leave it at that. Sorry for having stolen a couple of extra minutes, as I hope that we've been able to convey. What we're trying to do is bring these three elements of artistic representation, forest ecology, and stewardship together, and to present them to museum-going audiences, both in Brunswick at Bowdoin College and on the island. And we're really looking forward to that in time. My last words will be, this is a project that we enter into with a great deal of humility, understanding that there's a tremendous amount of knowledge on the island. And we're seeking your input on this project. And so we want for it to feel and to authentically be a community project. And so I will put in the chat our email addresses, and if you ever wanted to engage on any aspect of this, had something you wanted to share, by all means, write to one or both of us. Thanks, I'll stop there.
Thanks, everybody. And we're happy to take any questions from the audience.
Yeah, of course, we'll stay as long as you like.
Yeah, thank you, Frank and Barry, for bringing us into a deeper, more informed relationship to this island we love. And we know you are both continuing to work on this project, this portrait of the wildlands, and we look forward to the summer of 2025, when the exhibit that you're in the process of creating will come to Monhegan Museum. So now Tish Miller will lead us in a Q&A period for about 15 minutes, and you can put questions into the chat if you wish, or you can just ask Barry and Frank directly.
And there are some in the chat.
Round of applause, if we could, for these guys. It doesn't work on, but we can shake our hands as if we just to give it was a wonderful, wonderful talk. I think there are some questions in the chat, Barry, if you can find them, otherwise sure. I can feed them to you.
Yeah, let me go. I'll go back to the back here. So at its lowest, what % of the land was forested? I haven't done that exercise. Monhegan is just under a square mile in area. And we could go based upon the maps. I can imagine image analysis software that we could use to estimate that. So I think it's pretty much the boundaries of what you know as the Cathedral Woods is the boundaries of what remained forested. And so if I had to guess, if you think about the village of Monhegan, the community, and that's probably 35 to 40% remained forested, and the rest was cleared either for development or for pasture. But that's a guess. But that's something that we can get a better answer for. Yeah.
Here's another question. What factors caused the removal of sheep and other livestock in the early 1900s? This is a terrific question. And I'll be honest, at this stage in our research, we're not altogether certain why the transition away from sheep happened and why it happened at the very beginning of the 20th century. It may have to do with larger economies on the island. It may have to do with something involving the sheep population itself. We are actively trying to sort of document sheep on the island, as well as to understand why decisions were made to ultimately remove them in 1905.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I can give you a take, and I think there's more to the story, and I'm sure there's more to the story that's specific to Monhegan, but my understanding comes from a broader reading of what happened in New England. And there were a couple of factors to consider. New England underwent what historians describe as sheep mania. in the 19th century. And so there were large areas of forest removed to make way for pasture because you could make a living pasturing sheep for wool. And that was for a couple of reasons. There was a particularly good and productive variety. The merino sheep became available. The US government was imposing significant tariffs and import barriers on imported wool. And so the domestic wool market was booming as a result. And that was a nod towards agriculture. And as we moved into the latter part of the 19th century, the people who held the attention of the federal government were not so much the farmers, but the manufacturers. And the manufacturers then advocated for the removal of those tariffs to allow for the importation of foreign wool, which was cheaper. And so that contributed to a collapse of the New England's sheep farming for wool, as did the opening of the Erie Canal and the expansion of American farming westward into much more productive lands. And so you had this collision of factors that led people all over the place. And I live in Brunswick. This happened in Brunswick and parts down east of me too. They simply walked off the land. They had no choice but to do so. You could no longer make a living. So this rapid abandonment of pasture land was a broader phenomenon.
There's a question here about the photographer of the Cathedral Woods image. I think that the one that we were showing you was actually a Lorimore Brackett postcard. But of course, there have been so many wonderful photographers who have worked in the Cathedral Woods, going back to Samuel Triscutt, Eric Hudson, Bertrand Wentworth, Warner Taylor. And it's been a great pleasure to use the museum's archives to explore the photographic record from the late 19th century to today.
Yeah. John Bates posed a question, and thank you for your compliment. I really appreciate it. Expectations of climate change impacts. Some would argue, and I think there's some merit to this, that you're experiencing the impacts of climate change on Monhegan Island today. It's very hot and dry on Monhegan right now. The soils on Monhegan are exceptionally thin, and that is a legacy both of the sheep pasturing, which probably promoted erosion, but also just it's a reality in most of New England that the soils are quite thin. It's especially so on a rock in the ocean like Monhegan. All of that is to say that when it gets dry on Monhegan, the trees feel it really keenly, and it's hot and dry on Monhegan right now. And if you walk out onto the Pebble Beach Trail, you'll see that those trees are pretty stressed out. So to the degree that this sort of thing becomes more common, it will have impacts on what can survive here and its rates of growth and whatnot. I think you can expect that some trees will continue their northward migrations, advancements. This has been happening since the last glacial period, but it's accelerated now. So tree species that we don't tend to associate with places like Monhegan Island will ever more get a toehold. And of course, there's any number of other factors, bird migrations, bird populations, and ocean temperatures, ocean patterns of currents and ocean circulations. Gulf of Maine circulation can have profound impacts on Monhegan Island too, not just the fisheries, but even the local climate. So, there's a lot to look ahead to. There will be change, right? These are realities that we have to face. Some of this change would happen in the absence of climate change. Climate change is going to inflect that change.
There's a question here about whether these changes will alter the composition of migrating birds. And I think the answer is definitely yes. I'll let Barry talk a little bit more about the science of it, but I will simply say from the exhibition standpoint, we're hoping to record various soundscapes on the island that we can add to as an exhibition element. And we were at the Pebble Beach yesterday and listening to the wind, listening to the diesel boats, listening to the bells on the buoys, listening to the birds. And then when you went back into the cathedral woods, it was a totally different kind of soundscape, different kinds of birds that we were hearing. And so it'll be really exciting to do some of these recordings, these sound recordings on the island.
Yeah, you know, Jane, your question really prompts me to ask people who know better than I do. And so thank you for the prompt, because this is something that we should know better. Monhegan is on the flyways, right? And so it's a stopover for lots of birds. I don't expect for that to change. But yes, the changes in the composition of the forest will have impacts on what comes, what stays, how long it stays for. Those impacts I couldn't predict for you. Thanks for that comment, Martha.
Great.
And here's a question: is there any evidence that petrels and/or puffins ever nested on Monhegan or Manana? I'm not the person to ask. My guess is probably yes, but I don't know. Yeah, that's a good question, though. Here, Jane making the point, pretty sure lupin is blooming earlier than it used to. Yeah, lots and lots of things are blooming earlier than they used to. There's and actually one of our most important New England reference points for this is none other than Henry David Thoreau, who was himself an exceptional botanist and documented first appearances, first flowerings of the plants in his surroundings. And there's oh gosh, what is his name? It'll come to me later, but there's an ecologist at Boston University who's accessed these journals of Henry David Thoreau, and then another member of the Concord community from later decades, and then his own graduate students to document the acceleration in flowering and leaf out among plants. And it's anywhere from 2 to 3.5 weeks or more in Concord, Massachusetts. And so I expect that it would be something similar here on Monhegan as it is elsewhere. So.
All right. So sorry to say we've run out of time. I have a feeling you've generated so much interest. We could go on for a long time, and I wish we could. But before we say goodbye, I just want to say thank you again to both of you. Your creativity and your devotion to this has really been a wonderful contribution to the island and those of us who want to learn more and more about the island. So thank you so much. And we really look forward to the exhibit on the summer of 2025. But before we say goodbye, I wanted to direct everyone to the Monhegan Associates website and to go to the Summer Ecology Lecture Series. And you'll see there that our last lecture of the summer is the hidden fungal networks in the forests of Monhegan. And the talk will be given by Eric Lilasoff. He's a scientist, adventurer, research ecologist, and acting project leader in the U.S. Forest Service, and is an adjunct professor at Michigan Tech. And while you're on the website registering for the next talk, take this opportunity to donate to Monhegan Associates. So with that, I will say goodnight to you all.
Before you do, I want to say thank you. I will send a link for this talk to you and to everyone who may or may not have been here for this talk. I will send a link to you to the recording. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claire, and good night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks, everyone.
Ray. Thanks,
Again.
Ray.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.